So I received this message on Instagram from somebody who listens to my podcast. And um, over the last 2.5 years since I started that podcast and had this YouTube channel here, I've gotten this type of question or comment maybe 5 to 10 times over that period. So I wanted to bring it up because it goes well with this episode here of my PSA binder series, where I show, in this one, I'm going to show another vintage baseball legend, my Fab Four. But I wanted to mention that question because in in essence, the question was, now this was someone, I don't know his exact age, but pretty much I think everyone who's asked me this question has either been my age or younger. And what it basically comes down to is they have an interest in vintage sports cards, vintage baseball cards, but they don't really have that connection. They want to start collecting, but they don't really have that connection. Like with me, and I know a lot of you out there, uh, my appreciation started when I was a kid for players of the vintage era, like the last episode I had, Roberto Clemente. And as you may know, I collect Mickey Mantle. And in this episode, we're going to talk about Stan Musial. Um, my interest and appreciation for those guys started 30 years ago, 35 years ago. So, uh, and that was passed on. I started to think about it. I said, well, not everyone has that luxury where they have parents or a family that when they were kids passed on the stories and passed on that love of that era, an era that I never saw, but I've heard the stories, and I heard the stories in a way that developed that desire years later to want to spend a lot of money on sports cards with those guys on it. So I started to think about how that whole process worked. And for someone, I think probably like the person who asked that question on Instagram and the others that I've received, they maybe didn't have that sort of upbringing or experience in the past, but they're looking at it now, and it is an appealing time period, an era of the hobby to collect in. A lot of guys out there on Instagram, maybe they collect, 90s cards and on up, but they've never gone back that far to vintage. So this question was very interesting to me because I started to think, well, what did it for me? And it was not watching the players, right? Because I didn't do that. It was the stories. And it wasn't, in a lot of cases, long stories or even reading a long book, even though I have done that. But initially, it was just like the bits and pieces, let's call it an elevator pitch on those guys. And generally, it would start out with me asking, like, my dad, hey, tell me about Stan Musial. Was he good? I kind of would always phrase it that way because he would come back with, was he good? Let me tell you about this guy. And it generally would just be kind of like bullet points, And those bullet points fascinated me. For like the last one I did, Roberto Clemente. I didn't really go too into this type of thing for Clemente, but, for him, it was, I just remember sticking in my head was he finished his career with exactly 3,000 hits, and he had the greatest throwing arm in history. It was off the charts. And obviously, the way he died, helping others in a plane crash. So those just bullet points in my head, that was enough for me to just cement it in my head when I was a kid as a hero. And as you grow up and become, an adult, it stays with you. But I even think as an adult, even if that's not in you now, I think maybe not to as large of a degree or as strong of a connection, but I do think that still can be developed even in the later years. So I was thinking, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to show the cards here, my Fab Four Stan Musial cards. But I figured while I show those cards, I want to give an elevator pitch. So, this has nothing to do with, card prices or investing or players that will go up in value or anything like that. This is just like this guy was asking me. He was asking for a recommendation of who could he connect with. If I could recommend a player from that era, from the vintage era, to collect and to try to connect with their story, who would be one? And obviously, my last one, Clemente, that I did for sure. But this would be maybe my top one or two. Stan the Man Musial. It's not going to be Mickey Mantle, right? I collect Mickey Mantle, but I would never recommend someone collect Mickey Mantle. And I'll go into why in when I start showing these cards here. But I'm going to give my elevator pitch, a short pitch on why Stan Musial is a player that you should collect. Okay, so let's look at some cards and let me talk a little bit about Stan the Man. Now, look, I don't make it a habit on preaching or telling other people what to collect, who to collect, how to collect. But, if people are going to ask me in the way that question came in, it wasn't, hey, whose cards are going to go up in value the most or any of that stuff. It was basically, look, I'm looking to connect with a vintage baseball player. I don't have a lot of knowledge on it. Can you recommend a player or two? And so obviously, if I'm going to recommend someone, I'm recommending Stan the Man. I'll tell you why here in a minute, but I want to also mention this Fab 4 here. I have 3 of the 4. And as you can see, the one with the blue tape, that's a placeholder, little picture. I hope to get the 48 Bowman rookie in 2024 here. That will complete my 4. Shout out Lou Rock TV, just picked up a beautiful Stan Musial rookie I saw. Congratulations, Lou. I hope to do the same here. I'll go into these cards in a minute, but I also wanted to mention Shane, Shoebox Legends, my buddy. He started playing along with my first one when I showed my Fab 4 of Clemente cards. He did a video where he did the same, so love to see that. Anyone else who wants to play along here, make a video, tag me in it, and talk about or show your favorite Stan Musial cards, your favorite 4. If you could only pick 4, what would they be? So I want to give a little sales pitch. Number 10 on the ESPN top 100 baseball players list. Not the end-all be-all, but I agree. He's a top 10 for sure, all-time great. And Mickey Mantle was number 7 on that list. And if you were to switch those two, make Stan Musial 7 and Mantle 10, I would not argue with that. I would agree with that. I think Stan Musial belongs lower on that list than Mickey Mantle. As I mentioned earlier, I never recommend anyone collect Mickey Mantle. If you want to collect him, great. I do, but his cards are extremely expensive. And, I want to read a quote here. This was 2010. Stan Musial received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the top 2 highest civilian awards. President Obama called him an icon untarnished, a beloved pillar of the community, a gentleman you'd want your kids to emulate. And so that's a big point here, especially, if you have kids, and I have 2 young kids that in the not too distant future, when they'll be looking at my cards, I would assume they're probably going to ask me, who's Stan Musial? Why do you have his cards? And it's a great story to tell. Great human being, not only a great player, but a great human being. Every story I've ever heard about him is a positive one. Any person that I've ever heard talk about meeting him, it almost always seems like it exceeded their expectations, if not met them. So just a great, great person. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. Collecting, if you're going to collect players, why not make it a player that you can be proud to tell your kids about their story and who they were off the field too. One of the best stories I ever heard about Stan Musial, I've heard it told multiple times, but Willie Mays and Hank Aaron, they each told this story that I've heard. It was at an all-star game in the 1950s, and all the great black players, Frank Robinson, Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Ernie Banks, they were gathered in a corner of the National League clubhouse, and they were playing cards. And apparently no white players were anywhere near them, so it was very segregated in the clubhouse. And then Stan the Man, he walked up and just casually said, "Deal me in." And that was his way of letting those players know that they were welcome. And I think that says a lot about Stan Musial, about who he was. He was his own man and a great man. So that right there, you can collect a lot of legends. You can collect all-time great players. That's what I like to do. But if I'm going to recommend someone to collect in that type of situation I mentioned, it's going to be someone like Stan Musial. He's right at the top of my list. Let's get into these cards. So I don't have this one yet, like I mentioned, but I want the Bowman rookie. And I've mentioned before on my channel, I'm not the biggest black and white card guy. I like colored cards, but certain cards they're just meant to be black and white. I feel like this is one of them. I feel like this card is just perfect black and white, and I want this card. So that will be on my list. This one of my favorite cards of all time. Beautiful. One of my best cards in my collection. 1948 Leaf. 1948-49 Leaf. Stan Musial. It's in a PSA 4, but look at the colors. Look at the color on that. The blue background with I mean, I don't have to sell this card, but it's awesome. I love this card. And so that's number 2. Number 3, oh, what a perfect card. The 54 Red Heart, Stan Musial. I have a PSA 5.5, and just a perfect card. Look at the colors on this. The red just pops. Unbelievable card. Can't say enough about it. And then, maybe a surprise, but I chose his 58 Topps All-Star card. I love that whole set, subset, All-Star, 58 Topps All-Star set. Just is incredible. And this is Stan Musial's first Topps card. A lot of people know that, but a lot of people don't. So his first Topps card didn't come till 1958. This is a 5.5, beautiful copy. And, you know, along those lines, Stan Musial doesn't have as many cards, especially for someone who played as many years, 22 seasons, 23 seasons, something like that. For someone who played that long, he doesn't actually have that many cards compared to other vintage players. He was missing from a lot of key sets. So you could look at that and say, well, that's maybe one of the reasons why he's not as heavily collected, or his prices aren't as high as some of these other guys. Or you could look at it and say, well, that just makes the cards that he does have out there more special. That's kind of the way I look at it. Sure, I'd love if he had cards in 52 Topps and, 54 Topps and all these great sets, but, it just makes me appreciate these more. These are my Fab 4. What's your Fab 4? Anything in the comments. What's your sales pitch too? Do you agree with me that if someone were to ask you, and not asking for financial advice, but just asking from a collectability standpoint, who do you recommend if I had to choose a player? And assuming that obviously they don't have a connection, obviously if they're a Cardinals fan, you really need to convince them to collect Stan Musial if they know a lot about things. But if it's someone kind of coming in cold and they don't have a lot of background in it, but they're just looking for a great player to build a player collection from, who would you recommend? Would you recommend Stan too? Let me know in the comments. Thanks as always. See you on the next one.